Hi students, this is Gus Wachowski, and in this video we are going to be looking at period 1, and you can tell that it covers a wide margin of years going from 1491 to 1607, and this primarily will be covering the Native American inhabitants of the now present United States. And when you look at this map here, you might even recognize some of the names as current cities, particularly if you're familiar with the Miami Confederacy, Sioux out in the Dakotas, Cheyenne being the capital of Wyoming. And you see that they're going to be getting these names that are derived from these tribes. In fact, if you look at a lot of cities, particularly out in the Midwest, they do bear some namesake to the original Native American inhabitants. And really what's interesting is when you use the word Native American, it's sort of a catch-all, but it's really sort of a disservice in many respects that, to think that Lenape Indians were very similar to the Sioux Native Americans. They're not in really any respect other than that they were the original inhabitants here. So while I will be using the term Native Americans, it's very important to recognize that there are very, very distinct cultural and just overall differences amongst these tribes. It's similar to saying that somebody's culture out in Montana is very similar to somebody's in Florida. That could not be farther from the truth. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to just give you a broad overview of this. I mean, we are going to, for example, in the Mississippian region here across the Mississippi River, particularly in the southern half of the United States, very much important as this is more of a complex society based on maize, otherwise known as corn, and you're going to see this begin to fade out by the 1500s. But again, just keep in mind just the number of individual tribes that are inhabiting these areas, particularly by rivers, access to water. That's of course going to be very, very important. And remember, every single tribe has its own unique culture. But most importantly is going to be the role of maize and corn. This comes about in around the year 1000. It's going to spread from Central America, move its way up into North America, and we're going to see it grown particularly in the Southwest at first. But remember, for any crop to be grown, you need irrigation, water, right? So for example, in the Rio Grande, the Pueblos are going to certainly make good use of that. But it's going to be very important because with maize means that societies do not need to worry about hunting and gathering as much. You can be much more permanent because you know that this corn is going to grow. Whereas if you're hunting and you're gathering, that can be very, very time consuming. So now that we have maize cultivation, we can now focus on permanent settlements with villages and people. Now, moving to the Northwest in present-day California, we have about 300,000 natives that are living in California before any European contact. At this point, it's ruled mainly by hunters and gatherers. The Chinooks, for example, are some of the Native American tribes out there having warrior traditions, even utilizing advanced fighting techniques. You even see a canoe that was carved out. Quite complex there. You also have longhouses that are going to be used. So again, the Northwest, again, having its own type of culture and society. Now moving into the Great Plains and the Great Basin, many Native Americans are also going to be living off of hunting and gathering. There is, of course, if you've ever been out to the Great Plains and Great Basin, a lack of natural resource. It's relatively flat, it is pretty large, but what's going to be extremely important is going to be the introduction of the horse, because this is going to allow for hunting of buffalo. It's going to make it much more easier, and of course is going to have a big impact on them militarily. So in terms of being able to maneuver, move faster, that's going to be sort of a game changer for the Great Plains. Okay, and now moving on to the Northeast and Atlantic seaboard, you're going to see that there's going to be a good deal of hunting and gathering, some agriculture, and you're going to see some permanent villages like we saw with some other Native American tribes. The predominant one was, of course, the Iroquois, which would have inhabited present-day New York as well as some of Pennsylvania, and certainly they are known for burning forests, not only to hunt, but also to grow crops. And once again, their villages are going to be building around or built around rather maize, which is going to allow them to be much more permanent. One thing that's unique about the Iroquois is that they were a matriarchal based society, meaning that there was more female authority than you saw in other Native American tribes, and this sort of made sense. Women were in charge of councils and sort of decision making. Why might that be? Because they tended to be in the village, they were not out hunting and gathering, so it made sense for the people who were there more to be making these decisions. You don't really see that as much in other tribes. So they're going to be tending to crops, they're overseeing community affairs, all while men are hunting. So that's one of the unique parts of the Iroquois society. But again, just to show you that there were a wide range of Native American tribes prior to European contact, and these are only just some of the major tribes. I mean, there are many, many more tribes that you can get into. But here, looking a little bit more closely, you'll see the Iroquois, and they're going to form a confederacy, especially once the Europeans come together and make contact with Native Americans. You're going to see them forming a military alliance, which is going to be absolutely important. Now, moving on to day two, when you look at Christopher Columbus, certainly you've studied him. He's been in the news. You see statues of him actually even being beheaded. But certainly this quote sort of encapsulates Christopher Columbus. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And certainly you see the motivation of imperialism, right? It's the three G's: gold, God, and glory, but particularly gold is what many Europeans were looking to get. Now, the thing here is when you look at the Native American population in present-day Mexico, you're looking at about 35 million by the year 1500. By the time you get about a century later, you're around 2.5 million. And one of the reasons is going to be is disease that the Europeans are going to be bringing over. We'll get to that in a short period. But you notice sort of the cause and effect that as you see Native American populations dwindling, guess what you see increasing? The number of imported African slaves. You have an interesting relationship between these two graphs, and it's going to very much take off, particularly in the 1700s, as Africans are going to be utilized as the primary source of labor for the Europeans. But certainly you see these three ships here with Columbus, and of course going to be making contact in the New World. So let's get into the Americas in 1492. At this point, they are previously uncontacted by the rest of the world, and you have varying degrees of advancement. Again, that's very much true because Native Americans have very different cultures, they have very different practices, and one thing that's going to be true of all Native American tribes is that they are susceptible to old world diseases that the Europeans are going to bring about. Certainly, there's a lot of subjugation, there's a lot of violence, but what's going to really cause those numbers to dwindle are going to be, of course, the Europeans bringing that disease. Now, in Africa at this point, they had certainly developed in their own right. You do have some complex societies at this point, and they're going to, of course, be a huge, huge hub for slave labor. You're going to see that Europeans are going to sort of capture a lot of these Africans for the sake of their agricultural knowledge. It's going to be very important in terms of growing crops in the New World. So by 1492, you're going to see Europeans going out, embarking, hoping to, of course, acquire gold and, of course, sail for the sake of God and glory. Now you might be wondering, why are you looking at spaghetti right now? Well, this is something that's coming out of Christopher Columbus, and this is going to be called the Columbian Exchange. And this is the introduction of new plants, animals to Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and vice versa. So from North America, you're going to see a wide range of new crops being introduced, everything from sweet potatoes to avocados to pineapples, and then vice versa. You're going to see coffee, beans, onions, fruit, bananas, etc. One thing that you will see as well, diseases, everything from smallpox to even measles. So the Columbian Exchange is not all that good in some respects because you have the disease, but on another front, you do see the introduction of new culture sort of, beginning to mix with one another. And this still continues today in many respects. If you go to the Middle Eastern part of, if you go to Saudi Arabia, for example, there are McDonald's, and that's an example of cultural diffusion, which is exactly what the Columbian Exchange is all about. So certainly as we look at new crops, new animals, but of course the negative effects, disease, tobacco, and even slavery. And these diseases are very much airborne and touch. And Europeans are going to have this mindset that if Native Americans died, well, it's because they were non-Christians. Certainly science has not advanced too much at this point, but nevertheless, and here's some additional pictures of the Columbian Exchange that you can see here. But again, this is all responsible for bringing new culture and food and animals to North America. So we're going to leave it there for day 1 and 2. Please go to the next video for day 3.